It was many and many a year ago, in a kingdom by the sea, that a maiden there lived whom you may know by the name of Annabel Lee. Well, just what was the real name of Annabel Lee? We'll explore one of Poe's most famous poems and the people who might have inspired it on tonight's installment of the Curator's Crypt. Well, who was the real Annabel Lee? It's actually a pretty good question. People are still asking today. People I see at the museum, people who write me, people have been asking that ever since the poem first appeared in print 2 days after Poe's death, at the end of his obituary, right here. And who wrote that obituary? Well, Poe's own worst enemy, Rufus Wilmot Griswold. Poe and Griswold couldn't stand each other, but they'd known each other for the better part of a decade. They ran in the same circles, they knew the same people, and he would have heard a lot of the rumors going around about Poe's love affairs with different women. So if anybody's in a position to know who the real Annabel Lee might be, maybe it's Griswold. So who did he think Annabel Lee was? Well, the obituary leaves it very vague. He points out nearly all that he wrote in the last 2 or 3 years, including much of his best poetry, was in some sense biographical, in draperies of his imagination. Those who have taken the trouble to trace his steps could perceive, but slightly concealed, the figure of himself. There are perhaps some of our readers who will understand the allusions of the following beautiful poem. So here we've got Rufus Griswold coming out and saying, this is dedicated to somebody in Poe's life, and a lot of you, my readers, or Griswold's readers, will know who it is. But he doesn't come out and say it. So that leaves open the possibility it could be a few different people. And who did Rufus Griswold think it was? Well, there was a poet, a pretty prominent one, with whom Griswold was in touch, and with whom Poe had been engaged about a year before he died. Right here, Sarah Helen Whitman. Now, what's his reasoning? Well, she probably told him. Now, why did she think Annabel Lee was about her? It's kind of a long story. As I mentioned earlier, she and Poe were engaged roughly a year before he died. They had these great plans to be married, but her mother was staunchly against the wedding. So Sarah Helen Whitman here only agreed to marry Poe if he agreed to never touch alcohol again. So the engagement lasted for 1 month. And after that, Poe went to Whitman's house and pleaded with her to give him one last chance, but she wouldn't even speak to him. She just took some of her own ether and knocked herself out. Meanwhile, her mother kicked him out of the house. And that's the last she ever saw of him. Later, she felt kind of bad about treating him that way, so she wrote a poem in which she, in a coded message, asked for his forgiveness. So she believed that Annabel Lee was his encoded response to her encoded message in which he forgave her for being so harsh in the way she dumped him. So that's her reasoning behind this. But there's another contender. Right back here. Annie Richmond. And he was seeing her before and after Sarah Helen Whitman, so it's a lot more likely that he was thinking about her when he was writing the poem. In fact, in May of 1849, just about the time he finished the first draft of the poem, he sent her a copy of it before he'd even published it. So maybe Annie Richmond is a possibility. But there's more contenders. Let's look at yet another obituary of Poe. This one appeared in the Richmond Semi-Weekly Examiner and was written by one of Poe's frenemies, John Moncure Daniel. Now, they got along pretty well, except for that time that Poe challenged him to a duel, but they got over that, I think. But the obituary isn't entirely favorable. But here it is, reprinted in the Southern Literary Messenger. And right down here, he's talking about Poe's final days in Richmond. And by this time, Poe decided he was going to give up alcohol altogether and join a temperance group. So he says he joined the Sons of Temperance, and it was universally reported that he was soon to be married in the city. The lady was a widow, possessed of wealth and beauty, and was an old flame he declared to be the ideal and original of his Lenore. Now, that's Lenore. We've been talking about Annabel Lee. But who's this wealthy widow? And that brings us to another contender for Annabel Lee, and another one of Poe's fiancées. In fact, this is an engagement ring that Poe gave her just before he died. She's in the daguerreotype over here. It's Elmira Royster Shelton. He had been engaged to her when they were teenagers, and now that they're 40 years old, both their spouses have died, they got back together, so she completely fits the bill. So maybe he did tell her that you're my lost Lenore. In fact, one of her homes up in Ashland, Virginia is now called the Lost Lenore House because of that association. But what about Annabel Lee? Well, I get the feeling he told her she was Annabel Lee too. Here's a book, A Defense of Edgar Allan Poe, published by John J. Moran, who was Poe's attending physician at the time of his death. This was published in 1885 during Elmira Shelton's lifetime, so he went and interviewed her for his book. And she told him, or at least he's telling his readers that she told him, that Poe told her she was the real Annabel Lee. So maybe the kingdom by the sea is Richmond, and that sea is the James River. Not entirely far-fetched. In the poem, he does say that she was a child and I was a child, this kingdom by the sea, and they did grow up together next to the James River. So it seems to fit perfectly with that part, except the part where Annabel Lee's dead. But wait, there's more. There's another contender for Annabel Lee. This is the book Sappho, A Tragedy by Sarah Anna Lewis, who Poe called Stella. She was a poet of average talent, but her husband was pretty rich, and he used to pay Poe to write nice reviews of her, and she and her husband would patronize Poe, and so naturally, after Poe died, she took care of Poe's mother-in-law, who had nowhere else to go. And in order to get into her good graces, Poe's widowed mother-in-law said, you know, you were my Eddie's favorite. You were the real Annabel Lee. So Stella started telling everybody that she was the real Annabel Lee. And people got to talking, including other prominent poets in that circle, like Frances Sargent Osgood. And as soon as she heard the rumor, she said, there is no way that Stella is the real Annabel Lee. She said that Poe couldn't stand her, that when he saw her coming to the front steps, he'd duck out the back door just to get away from her. And this is coming from somebody who was very close to Poe and his wife, and in fact, a few years earlier, had been accused of being in a scandalous affair with Poe. So she was in a position to know all the players. So who did she think was the real Annabel Lee? She said Annabel Lee is and could only be Poe's beloved wife, Virginia. She fits the bill. They met when they were young. In fact, she was 9 years old when he first met her. She was 13 when he married her. And unlike all those other women, and like Annabel Lee, she was already deceased by the time he wrote the poem. So by the time Rufus Griswold wrote his biography of Poe, he'd heard about Francis Osgood saying that Virginia was the real Annabel Lee. So when he published articles about Poe after this, including this one from the October 1850 issue of the International Miscellany, he quoted from Francis Osgood's article of the charming love and confidence that existed between his wife and himself, always delightfully apparent to me, in spite of the many little poetical episodes in which the impassioned romance of his temperament impelled him to indulge. Of this I cannot speak too earnestly, too warmly. I believe she was the only woman whom he ever truly loved, and this is evinced by the exquisite pathos of the little poem lately written called Annabel Lee, of which she was the subject, and which is by far the most natural, simple, tender, and touchingly beautiful of all his songs. I've heard it said that it was intended to illustrate a late love affair of the author, but they who believe this have in their dullness evidently misunderstood or missed the beautiful meaning latent in the most lovely of all its verses, where he says, "A wind blew out of a cloud, chilling my beautiful Annabel Lee, so that her high-born kinsman came and bore her away from me." So take that, Stella. Take that, Sarah Helen Whitman. Francis Osgood saying, the one and only inspiration for this poem has got to be his beloved wife, Virginia. And not only did Griswold print it in his articles from then on, he also repeated this claim, quoting Osgood herself, in Volume 3 of the works of Edgar Allan Poe, in which Griswold included his biography of Poe. So we've got it on pretty good authority here, but that still hasn't stopped the speculation. So who do you think is the real Annabel Lee? Is it Annie, Elmira, Sarah, Stella, Virginia, or is it Fanny Osgood? Let us know down in the comments. And if you'd like to help the Poe Museum preserve precious Poe pieces, like this early printing of Annabel Lee from Sartain's Union magazine from the January 1850 issue, or this from 1 month after Poe's death in the November 1849 issue of the Southern Literary Messenger, why not support the Poe Museum by becoming a patron at patreon.com/Poe Museum. If you can't do that right now, please just spread the word about the work the Poe Museum is doing by liking, sharing, and subscribing. And until next time, thanks for joining us, and I'll leave you with more gratuitous footage of the Poe Museum cats doing cat stuff.